Okay, let's get into the evidence for humans expanding out of Africa and moving into places other than Europe. We have already talked about Homo erectus moving out of Europe in sites like Tbilisi, Tbilisi is a different place. Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia in Central Asia by about 1.77 million years ago. And about not long after that, or about that same time, Homo erectus appears in Java. But Java was probably connected to the mainland at that time, and by about 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus was well established in China. And it looks as though Homo erectus continued on as a species, similar to some of the features that they had in their original African population in East Asia longer than the rest of the world. There's Homo erectus fossils that from Nangdong that date to between about 46,000 to 27,000 years ago. Now this is overlapping with when humans and Neanderthals in Europe were interacting. Now, when Homo erectus was moving through the Asia in particular, when late Homo erectus, I should say, was moving into Asia, into East Asia, and places like Java. I mentioned in a previous chapter that the ice ages would have trapped a lot of water that otherwise would have been in the oceans, meaning that the ice ages actually brought the levels of the sea down. So there would have been more exposed land masses, and places that later became islands at that time were actually connected by land masses. For instance, Sahul, as we now call the ancient landmass of us, which linked Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea, was actually an island separate from East Asia, but it was much larger and connected some of the things that we now think of as islands. And another landmass, Sunda, was most of Southeast Asia, including some of the islands of Indonesia, were all connected in a landmass. There were, however, a string of islands that we call Wallacea, after Wallace, who identified and discovered these geographical landmasses. That was a string of islands in between Sahul, which is now shrunk to the size of Australia, and Sunda, which is shrunk to the size of Southeast Asia and Indonesia and some of those islands. And the Wallace line runs through Wallacea, where there was no connection between Sunda and Sahul at that time. And that's an important line, this Wallace line, because the animals and plants that we see in Australia have been geographically isolated. This Wallace line demonstrates that actually that Australia has been cut off from mainland Asia for a very long time. And so that's why you have animals in Australia that you don't get many in any other place, like marsupials and Alatheria and monotremes and that sort of thing. So the unique flora and fauna in Australia were cut off by this Wallace line. So when did humans cross this Wallace line? Well, could Homo erectus get there? Did they get there? Homo erectus was able to get to the island of Flores. There are tools there dated to 900,000 to about 800,000 years ago. But this is on the other side of this is in the Wallacean archipelago. So Homo erectus had to cross this Wallace line by sea. They were able to get to Flores. No land bridge existed. But what we do know about the island of Flores, which is now part of Indonesia, it would have been an island when Homo erectus got there, but no land bridge existed. But two large species of animal also crossed over. So it's quite likely that successful passage could have taken place because it was the lower sea levels made it much closer. It was and also favorable currents could have enabled maybe just rafting on some vegetation, or maybe just getting washed out to sea and a population of Homo erectus. This happens sometimes with animals, and you have certain characteristics start to take place or start to emerge from these creatures, things like island dwarfism, when animals, a breeding population of animals gets trapped on an island someplace, they become smaller and smaller and smaller, because if there's no natural predators to keep them large, it actually they benefit from being larger to ward off predators. They'll get smaller because they do better by not having to consume as much nutrition. So on an island where there's limited resources, smaller animals do better as long as there aren't predators that help encourage them to be larger size. So you get things like pygmy elephants, pygmy hippos in island communities, and apparently this also happened to Homo floresiensis, which is probably a very late form of Homo erectus that came to the island of Flores in Indonesia. And they existed as late as 18,000 years ago. Now this is well into when humans are doing all sorts of interesting things, Homo sapiens. But they, rather than developing the way that we've seen Homo erectus by prioritizing the brain as an important organ for survival, it seems as though Homo floresiensis was finding a different strategy for survival, and the brain, actually a large brain, became kind of a deficit. They did have tools. They did make tools, but being more clever than a Homo erectus was really not an advantage. In fact, it was probably a disadvantage, because you got to feed that brain, so it better do good for you. So it's possible that their small body size, their small brains, which were only about 380 cc's, not even much bigger than a chimpanzee's, could be to this long-term geographical isolation from other branches of Homo erectus. Their tools, they did use them, but they were simple and they were small. They are associated with faunal remains, and there are cut marks on bones. So it seems like the simple tools that their brains were able to use and create were enough for them on this island, and they went off in a different trajectory. Now, there is no evidence for humans crossing this line into Sahel, or what we now would find as Australia, much reduced landmass of Australia. So how did, when humans came to go across the sea, use their imaginations? How could they have gotten to Sahel, which is Australia today? Well, there's no evidence of this happening in the Pleistocene. So in our until the Holocene, which is only the past, or I should say, of Homo erectus, or mammals, other mammals, Asian mammals. In the Pleistocene, it appears as though Homo sapiens, modern humans, did cross the Wallacea into Sahel by two routes, possibly. An indirect northern route that would have required a sea voyage of greater than 10 kilometers, which is pretty substantial distance already. You would need some kind of something to at least float that distance, and the currents had better be working for you, or a more direct southern route that would have required a sea voyage of about 90 kilometers, and that's almost certainly out of visible range. Humans did make their way to Australia, and recall in your brain, in your minds, of what we've learned about humans moving into Europe. We talked about that already and what they encountered, but humans must have moved out of Africa into Asia much earlier, because the evidence for humans being in Australia already predates that of humans moving into Europe by 10,000 years, at least. Nawalabilla in northern Australia has evidence for humans with flakestone tools, grinding stones, scrapers, dating back to between 60,000 to 53,000 years ago. That's well before some of the things that we're talking about in Europe, right? There are even deeper levels of this site as well that remain to be excavated. Lake Mungo in southern Australia also have dates from about 50 to 40,000 years ago, also predating what we were talking about in Europe as well. They have burials, they have stone tools of flakes and cores, they have hearths, and they have animal and fish bones that tell us a bit about what their diet was like. Was there any occupation of Australia before then? There are some suggestions by some excavations at Jimium Cave that could support an earlier occupation. They are to 116,000 years ago, but the dates are problematic and not universally agreed upon. That's a pretty extremely early date for which we don't really have much supporting evidence for. So I think we need to hold on any decision about those very early dates before 60,000 years ago in Australia until we get some more evidence and better, more conclusive evidence than we have at present. But it could point to maybe an earlier dispersal. Maybe this is evidence, instead of we're getting good evidence for a later wave, maybe there was an earlier wave of humans that came across to Australia at an earlier date, and that's why we don't have a lot of evidence for it. What happened when humans got to Australia? Well, there's a peculiar phenomenon. There were megafauna. There were big animals in Australia. About 50 to 40,000 years ago, 23 of 24 of these genuses, the genera of the genus that we're talking about, not just species, but genera, the genus, went extinct at this time. So what happened? An easy conclusion to jump to would be, well, humans arrived at the same time that all these animals died out, so humans are to blame. And in the past, that was often where the conclusion we jumped to. But maybe the reason why people were coming in at this time is because there were things like environmental changes that were causing humans to move into new locations, and maybe those same environmental changes could have put pressure on animals to either adapt or die or go extinct. So what killed all of these megafauna in Australia? Well, we don't really have any evidence of tools associated with the bones of these extinct animals. We find some of the extinct animals in Australia, but we don't have any evidence that humans were causing their death or any association with their bones, in fact. So what could have happened? Well, maybe humans were at least in part to blame, because when humans come into a place, they basically take advantage of whatever they can, however they can. They're out for survival just like every other living thing. And one thing that could have taken place is destruction of the landscape writ large. So humans probably were gathering plant foods in addition to hunting, and one way to promote the growth of things like grasses that might be edible is to take a stick and start burning things, level whole ecological zones, and then it all starts back up again with the grasses that you want. So humans moving into Australia may very well have changed the landscape, changed the ecology to suit them better, and that could have then had an impact on the ecology of some of the megafauna that were living there that no longer found that their food sources were available. At this time, human groups were establishing themselves as communities, and they were developing niches for themselves in different environmental zones. And they also were creating links to their past. I'm going to talk a lot more about this when we start to talk about the Neolithic Revolution. I mentioned that in Chapter 2, but I'm going to mention it right now because for the rest of this chapter and for a lot of the next couple of chapters, we're going to start talking about, we're going to talk about how humans are mobile. They're moving through landscapes. That's really one of the primary foci of what we're talking about today, right now. Humans are in this expansion out of Africa into new zones, looking beyond the horizon, thinking, where can I go next? Sometimes you run out of places to go, though. Sometimes you move into a zone and there's no other horizon that you can find. Australia seems to be one of these places. So what happens when you hit the end of the road, like Australia? Well, you come up with a new system. Other than becoming mobile, you've got to negotiate your territory. You've got to come to kind of an equilibrium that you can survive as your community, but maybe also survive in cooperation with the next community over. And this is where cultural anthropology can help us to understand how new traditions start to emerge from some of these groups. Some may have come up with new economic strategies, and we're going to look at that more closely in the next coming chapters on sedentism and the shift to agriculture and domestication of animals. But even if you don't do that, even if you continue to be a hunter and a gatherer, you still have to have a territory, and that territory may butt up against another group's territory. So what do? You create an idea of who you are as a people, and that may be different from who those people over there are. And so it seems as though Australia has created this sense of identity of who they are and how they have ties to the land for tens of thousands of years. They have a highly developed sense of myth and ritual traditions. And one of these that is strong evidence for us, because not everything survives archaeologically, but rock art is one of these things that we can see. Some of it is extremely old. And the craft of producing rock art still exists amongst Aboriginal peoples in Australia. Gunbil Murrung is one site that has a beeswax figure of a turtle that's dated to 4,000 years ago. But it is on top of 6 other sets of figures, which means that those go back further in time, right? Also, Arnhem Land Cave has a mud wasp nest that wasps built on top of a painting of a human figure and the mud wasp nest was dated to 16,400 years ago. That means that the human figure has to be older than the mud wasp nest, which is 16,400 years ago, or old, right? So really old traditions tying groups of people to their land. what about beyond Australia? What did other groups of humans do? Well, it appears as though Micronesia and Polynesia, some of which were visible, some of these islands were visible from mainland or from New Guinea. By 35,000 years ago, islands visible from New Guinea were populated. About 29,000 years ago, migration to the island of New Britain, which is not visible from any other islands, appears. So humans were moving to New Britain, which is beyond the horizon, by 29,000 years ago. So they must have had boats, and they must have had some idea of how to navigate. And by 20,000 years ago, many islands are settled in Micronesia and Polynesia, and there's evidence for trading voyages between the islands. So people weren't just going to one place and then getting stuck. They were actually retaining those ties to their former communities and trading back and forth. So they knew where they went and they kept in communication. In Melanesia, in particular, the Lapita culture about 3,500 years ago developed sedentism. They started staying put, and they started implementing farming communities and fishing settlements. And from the Lapita culture, there's very strong archaeological evidence that subsets of that Lapita culture in Melanesia then took to sail. There's evidence for a double-hulled canoe that they must have been able to take out far into beyond the horizon into the Pacific. And it really still blows my mind to think that someone could get into a double-hulled canoe and just look up at the stars and navigate into the unknown. There's no guarantee that you're going to hit anything out there, but they did, and they came. The social structure of this Lapita culture and moving from island to island created a whole chain, a whole sequence of stair-stepping through the Pacific, eventually ending up in Hawaii by about 1,000 years ago, and New Zealand in another direction that expansion took about 1,500 years ago. So that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of Australia and the Pacific expansion. There's going to be another video, and we're going to talk about the expansion of humans into North and South America. Catch you then.